Welcome to Enthusiastical History. You're listening to the introduction episode of our new series, Anglo-Saxon Britain. In this series, we're going to tell the story of Anglo-Saxon England, starting from the first settlers and going all the way to the Battle of Hastings. We will be covering a time span of roughly 6 centuries. Our aim for this series is to create a linear story that appeals to people who has no knowledge regarding the era, while maintaining enough detail to educate while entertaining. There are, however, a few problems we'll be facing throughout the series, and I decided to make this episode to both address them and also clarify a few things before getting into the story. The time period we are covering is a problematic one regarding sources, especially the first few centuries. As the influence of Roman culture weakened, so did learning and literature. By the time Romans left Britain, which also happens to be the start of our story, there was almost no one left in Britain who could read and write, and more importantly, could and would hold records. Britain had always been a distant province of the empire, so it wasn't as influenced as other provinces to begin with, and now with the Romans gone, only the Romanized British elite of urban areas were there to keep the culture alive. That too, however, would change soon enough, for Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived from beyond the sea and started pushing the Britons towards the isolated edges of the island. Anglo-Saxons didn't keep any records until they were Christianized, as is often the case with pagan tribes, but the records they've started keeping are also mostly lost to us, since these documents were written and kept in monasteries and other religious centers, which were prime targets for the Vikings during the Viking Age. Consequently, we have very few sources. One is De Excidio et Conquesto Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, written by a British monk named Gildas who lived sometime around the 6th century. Problem with this book is that it's a sermon in 3 parts, written by an angry monk with the aim of criticizing both secular and religious authorities. Gildas intended to preach while writing the book, rather than writing a history of his people. Naturally so, the language is very vague. He gives almost no details, very few names, and no dates. Nonetheless, it is the only contemporary source and is therefore a very valuable book. The next source we'll be using is Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Ancorum, or Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is also the book which inspires the name of our channel, if you couldn't tell. This is a book written by yet another monk, this time an English one, Bede, or as it's known today, Saint Bede the Venerable. Bede is thought to have finished writing the book about the year 731. Unlike Gildas, who Bede was using as a source, Bede was writing a book of history, so it is more useful as a source. Indeed, Bede is our most important source for the era. Still yet, the author being an Anglo-Saxon Christian, he is very hostile to Britons and pagans. Apart from that, there's another problem, which is that the book contains both real and legendary stories. Stories like the one I've narrated in our video, Dryteb, the man who came back from death. There are other sources, such as royal charters, documents, the most famous and important of them being the tribal hidage, accounts of saints' lives, and of course the archaeological record. But mainly, these 2 books I've mentioned above are our primary contemporary sources. So we have these 2 books and some documents which help us create a storyline, a timeline that is full of blanks which are filled by modern day historians such as David P. Kirby, Sir Frank Stanton, and Mark Morris, and many others. Morris's book, The Anglo-Saxons, is a must-read for the average reader interested in the topic, and I highly recommend it since Morris manages to give enough details to make his book worth reading, while he masterfully avoids dabbling in details that will bore the reader. What he does is exactly what I intend to do in our series. That is, however, as you might guess, is a difficult job. The Anglo-Saxon history is full of blanks. Legend and history is often mixed and sometimes inseparable. We usually know the events, but don't know how or why they happened. It is a lot of guesswork. Therefore, I'm going to refer to historians' educated guesses and sometimes make them myself to spare you the trouble. Consequently, you will hear the words probably and perhaps 1,000 times throughout the series, so you better get used to it. There will be a storyline easy to follow where things are simplified whenever necessary. For those of you who want extra details, there will be bonus episodes explaining terms and concepts in more detail. As an example, we can talk a little bit about the kingdoms. According to common knowledge, there were 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms by the end of the 5th century. The truth is, if you look closer, you will see that there were much more than 7 kingdoms. If you were to look even closer, you will see that there were no kingdoms at all. There were tribes and confederations of tribes that slowly and painfully merged into the kingdoms that we know today. For example, the area we know as Mercia had at least 10 tribes living in it, as you can see on the screen. But for the sake of simplicity, we will pretend as if that wasn't the case, unless the tribe needs to be mentioned for narrative purposes, lest we be lost in details. I've mentioned earlier how history and legend was mixed. A perfect example is the first event of our story, the arrival of Anglo-Saxons. Both Gildas and Bede mention how 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa arrived from the continent with their ships and thus started the migration. Bede adds that Angles, Saxons, and Jutes settled in different parts of the island. But today, thanks to archaeological record, we know that it wasn't only these 3 tribes who migrated. There's evidence telling us that there were more tribes, such as Franks and Frisians. Furthermore, the story of Hengist and Horsa being the first settlers seems to be invented as well. Their names mean stallion and horse. Brothers with alliterative names is a frequent feature of European foundation myths. Mark Morris puts it this way, and I quote, Hengist and Horsa are no more likely to have existed than Romulus and Remus. Nonetheless, we will start our story with Hengist and Horsa because, albeit being a legend, the story contains at least some truth. That will be the case throughout our stories. When we can't form a storyline from truth only, we will look to legend to help us navigate our way. Such topics as Hengist and Horsa and the nature of kingdoms will be discussed in more detail in our extra episodes. The reason I'm not including these in the main series is because they aren't necessary for people who just want the story rather than all the details. Another problem we'll be facing is maps. Up until the early modern times, borders weren't clearly defined lines as they are today. They were very vague, non-existent at places, unless there were natural features acting as borders. Even then, there's the problem of identifying those places. Geographical features changed throughout time. For example, the Isle of Thanet, which was given to Hengist and Horsa upon their recruitment by the British king, isn't an island anymore. Over time it was merged to the main island, and there are many such cases which confuse the historical borders even more. Aside from the obvious problem, there's also the fact that we've mentioned earlier. The traditional 7 kingdoms are political entities that emerged later into the history, and it is impossible to know just how many peoples were there and where exactly their lands started and ended. Therefore, we'll be sticking to the traditional maps for the video. The maps we will be using are not totally accurate, they're just there to help viewers visualize and get a better grasp of the geopolitical situation. So, that's all for now. I hope that I did a good job at explaining my thought process and aims regarding these series. And if I failed, well, you'll get it as you listen. And lastly, before finishing the video, I want to thank my girlfriend for immense support and encouragement. It is thanks to her that I was able to undertake such an ambitious project. And so, here ends the episode 0, the introduction. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.